The shop was in Gardena, California, which is a flat working town south of Los Angeles, and what the shop did for a living was press pop singles. That is worth holding on to, because it is not the room anybody pictures. There is no clean room in this part of the story, no white coats, no NASA seal on a door. There is a light industrial business in a South Bay suburb whose trade was turning out records for people to buy. And on the 23rd of August 1977, 8 copper discs went into a plating bath on its floor. 12 inches across, according to the catalogue that holds the spare. About 1.5 millimeters thick, the thickness near enough of 2 credit cards laid together. Copper, which is the ordinary metal of the record business, cheap and soft and everywhere. They came out gold. Somebody in that shop handled them. Somebody set the current, watched the timer, lifted 8 discs out of a bath and set them somewhere to dry. The ordinary, competent motions of a trade. And the objects going through those hands are now, by a distance nothing else comes close to, the furthest things our species has ever put anywhere. Not solid gold, plated, a skin of it, laid down over the copper by electricity in a bath, the same process the shop would have used on any other Tuesday for any other customer. 3 days earlier, the first of the 2 spacecraft had already left the ground. Well, here we are, friends. The day has done whatever it was going to do. It is not asking anything more of you tonight. Get comfortable. Nothing in the next hour needs you alert. Tonight is the golden record. 2 of them, in fact, bolted to the outsides of the 2 Voyager spacecraft in 1977, carrying greetings in 55 languages, 90 minutes of music, 115 photographs, the recorded sound of a thunderstorm. Both are still going. They are the furthest human objects there have ever been. This is a thing I have known about since I was a boy, the way most people know about it, as a picture. A gold disc spinning somewhere in the dark with our music on it. That picture is doing a great deal of work, and almost none of it is accurate. The disc does not spin out there. Nothing turns it. It is bolted flat to the side of a spacecraft in an aluminium jacket with a needle and a cartridge taped alongside it because nobody assumed whoever found it would happen to own a turntable. And there is a question I could not answer. It is the simplest question anybody asks about it. I went looking for the answer the way you would look for anything. In the book the people who made it wrote afterward about making it. 6 of them wrote that book. It runs to about 270 pages, explaining their choices as it goes. Why a record instead of a plaque? Why one kind of metal instead of another? Which music went on, which did not? Who argued for what? The question is, why gold? There is no such sentence. What turned up instead is worth the whole hour, and it is going to wait until the end, because it only means anything once you have watched them make the thing. So, how the idea arrived, and who was in the room. What 6 people decided to put in a few weeks with a launch date that could not be moved. What they left out, and who said no. And what the object actually is underneath the name we all use for it. But first, 5 years earlier, and a much smaller thing bolted to a different spacecraft. 5 years earlier there had been a plaque. Pioneer 10 went up in 1972, headed out past the planet Jupiter and then out of the solar system altogether. According to the account, somebody had the thought that a thing leaving forever ought to say where it came from. So a small plate of gold anodized aluminium was bolted to its struts. Carl Sagan proposed it. Frank Drake worked out the physics of what to put on it. Linda Salzman-Sagan, an artist, did the drawing. What is on that plate is a diagram of a hydrogen atom, a starburst map locating the Sun against 14 pulsars, an outline of the spacecraft for scale, and, standing in front of the spacecraft outline, a man and a woman, drawn plainly and without clothes. The reasoning was straightforward. Whoever finds this will not know what we look like. What happened next is the part worth keeping. American newspapers printed the plaque because it was a good story, and the record says some of them printed it altered. At least one erased the man's genitals before publication. Another erased his and also the woman's nipples. The first letter our species ever addressed to anybody outside the solar system went out into the dark, and the correspondence that came back, the letters pages, the columns, the complaints, was substantially about decency. I find that neither funny nor depressing, particularly. It is just what happens when a species writes a letter. The letter has to get past the species first. The plaque itself, meanwhile, went on doing its job perfectly well, being made of metal and several 100 million miles away by then. It is out there now, unaltered, genitals intact, which is the small joke the universe gets to keep. And it establishes the rule that governs everything else tonight. Every single thing on the Voyager record had to be agreed by people who were also worried about what a newspaper would say. That constraint is in the object. You can point at the places where it bit. The other thing the plaque established was a limit. A plate that size holds a diagram and almost nothing else. No sound, no faces, no weather, no cities, no crowds, no music. Nothing that would tell a finder what it is actually like here, as opposed to where here is. According to the record, that limit is exactly what was on the table when the next opportunity came round. 2 more spacecraft were being built, larger, better instrumented, and on a trajectory that would take them out of the solar system as well. Somebody was going to have to decide whether to do it again, and whether to do it bigger. The call came from a project manager. John Cassani, the record says, was running Voyager at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, the person responsible for the spacecraft actually existing, on schedule, within budget, with every instrument bolted where it belonged. That is not a job that leaves much room for gestures, which makes the call itself the interesting part. Nothing about the message was going to help the spacecraft work. It added mass, however little. It added a task. It added a thing that could be got wrong in public. A project manager with a launch window and a fixed budget picked up a telephone anyway. Cassani telephoned Carl Sagan, the Cornell astronomer who had proposed the Pioneer plaque, with a request of one line. Do it again, and do it better this time. The answer came from Frank Drake, an astronomer whose particular subject was listening. To understand the answer, it helps to know one thing about him. In 1960, Drake had pointed a radio telescope at 2 nearby stars to listen for somebody. 2 stars, a few weeks, a single narrow band. He heard nothing. He was 30 years old. It was the first search of its kind anybody had ever run, and he spent the rest of a long working life on that same question. How you would find anyone. How anyone would find you. Drake's answer to Cassani's request was that a plaque was the wrong object. A plaque holds a diagram. A phonograph record holds a diagram and an hour of sound, and by the same encoding trick that carries the sound, it can carry pictures too. The technology to play one is a needle and a rotation. It is, by some distance, the most information anyone knew how to bolt to the outside of a spacecraft in 1977. There is a plainness to that reasoning I have come to like. Not what would be beautiful, not what would be profound. What holds the most and can be played by somebody starting from nothing. So, not a plate, a record. Pictures encoded on one side, sound on the other. That is the whole idea. As far as the record shows, it arrived in a conversation between two men who had each spent years on the question of how you say anything at all across a distance like that. Name the committee by trade, and it stops sounding like a committee. Carl Sagan, an astronomer at Cornell, chairing it. Frank Drake, another astronomer, working out how the thing would be encoded so that somebody starting from nothing could decode it. Anne Druyan, a writer, as creative director, responsible for building an essay out of sound. Timothy Ferris, and this is the part people blink at, a music journalist. An editor at Rolling Stone, brought in to produce the record, because producing a record is a specific craft, and he had it. John Lomberg, an artist, running the pictures, and Linda Saltzman Sagan, gathering the spoken greetings. 6 people. Hardly a NASA employee among them. No selection process produced that list. No panel of experts was convened. No nominations were taken. No institutions signed off on who was qualified to speak for the species. A man with a deadline rang a man he trusted, who rang the people he happened to know were good. That is who spoke for everyone who has ever lived. And nobody elected them, and nobody pretended otherwise. Kasani telephoned Sagan. Sagan called people he knew and trusted. Those people called others. That is how most things actually get made. Then the clock. The launch window, according to the mission record, was not a preference. 2 spacecraft were going to a particular configuration of outer planets, an alignment that would not come round again for something like 176 years, and the dates that flowed from that were fixed by orbital mechanics rather than by anybody's schedule. The working time the committee had, by the accounts they gave afterward, was a few weeks. Not a few weeks to record it, a few weeks to decide what humanity is, in a form that fits on one disc for an audience nobody can describe. The budget is reportedly almost nothing. The figures that circulate run from low 4 digits up to around $18,000, with people covering some cost themselves, calling in favors from anyone who owed them one. That range is worth stating as a range because the sources do not agree, and there is no reason to pretend they do. Here is the thing I keep turning over about the deadline. A few weeks is not enough time to do this properly. It is, however, exactly enough time to do it honestly. Nobody had the months it would take to convene a panel or run a survey or argue their way to a consensus that could be defended afterward to a committee of anybody. They had to work fast, from what they personally knew, personally loved, could physically lay hands on before a truck left for Pasadena. Which means the record is not a portrait of humanity. It is a portrait of what 6 specific people could reach in a few weeks in 1977. And that turns out to be the most human thing about it. Before there was a single sound on it, there was a decision about what it would be made of. February or March of 1977, according to Sagan's own dating. No greetings recorded, no music chosen, no photograph selected. None of the things anybody remembers. What the committee settled first was the physical object, and the reasoning survives because Sagan wrote it down. Making a record in 1977 went in stages, and it helps to walk them slowly. First, somebody cuts the sound into a soft disc. That one is the original. It is delicate. It is the only copy. Nobody is going to sell it or ship it anywhere. So from that soft original, they make a hard one in metal. Think of it as a cast taken off the original, every ridge where the original had a valley. That metal one is not for listening to either. It is a tool. And from the tool, they make the parts that stamp out the thousands of copies people take home. That metal one in the middle has a name in the trade. It is called a mother. It is the only object in the building that exists purely so other objects can exist. Nobody plays a mother. There is no reason to. It goes in a rack to wait. Sagan's line from the book. It seemed ideal to send a mother to the stars. His reason, in the same sentence, its resistance to erosion in space would be considerably greater than an ordinary vinyl record's. Sit with that a moment. The object bolted to the spacecraft is not a record in the sense anybody means when they say record. It is the tool that records are made from. The one item in the whole factory that was never intended to be listened to by anybody, chosen precisely because it is the toughest thing on the premises. The second decision is the one that tells you what kind of project this really was. A mother can be nickel. Nickel is standard. Nickel is what a plant would reach for. And the committee did not use nickel, and Sagan says why. Because nickel is ferromagnetic. Voyager carries magnetometers, instruments for measuring magnetic fields, out on an arm 13 meters long, held that far from the body of the spacecraft precisely so its own electrical noise does not drown the reading. A magnetic disk bolted to the flank of that spacecraft is a problem for the science. So, copper. The message to the stars was shaped, at the level of what atoms it is made of, by an instrument designed to measure magnetism. Not by meaning, not by symbolism, by the requirement not to spoil somebody else's data. Now hold those two decisions side by side, because they are the most carefully documented choices in the entire object. Why a mother? Recorded with a reason. Why copper and not nickel? Recorded with a reason. Why gold? Over the top of that copper, in a bath in Gardena 5 months later. Nothing. No sentence, no paragraph, no meeting, no name attached to the decision. No date beyond the date of the plating itself. The committee's own book, in which every other choice gets its explanation, does not explain this one. I want to be careful about how strong that claim is, so here is exactly how it was established. The book was searched, page by page, for the words that would have to appear in any explanation. Plating, inert, corrode, corrosion, tarnish, oxidize, vacuum. Not one of them is in it. Gold appears, but only ever as a description of what the thing looks like. That is very strong evidence of an absence. It is not the same as having read every line, but every place the reason should be, there is something else. Set that aside for now. It sits there for the rest of the evening, and we will come back to it when there is something to put beside it. The greetings were collected by walking down a corridor. Linda Saltzman Sagan, an artist who had drawn the figures on the Pioneer plaque, needed people to say hello in as many languages as could be managed. And Cornell has language departments, and language departments have people in them who speak the languages. So she went along the hallways, knocking on doors, asking whoever happened to be in whether they would mind saying a few words into a microphone for a spacecraft. 55 languages went aboard. The account says nobody wrote a script. People were told roughly what it was for and left to decide for themselves what a person ought to say to a stranger under those circumstances, which is why the greetings do not match. Think about what it would be like to be asked. Somebody puts their head round your office door on an ordinary working afternoon to explain that there is a spacecraft, that it is leaving, that it is not coming back. And would you mind? You have perhaps a minute to decide what your language should say. Then you say it once, into a tape recorder, in a room with the radiator on. A few are formal, others are audibly shy. One or two go past hello into something closer to a blessing. Two of them are worth stopping on. The first is Akkadian. It was the language of Sumer, unspoken as anybody's mother tongue for something like 2,000 years. A language reconstructed by scholars from clay, spoken aloud in 1977 by a man reading it off a page for a machine leaving the solar system. The second is in English. It is the last one on the disc, and it was recorded by a 6-year-old. Hello from the children of planet Earth. That is Nick Sagan, the astronomer's 6-year-old son. According to the accounts, he was told what the record was and left to work out the sentence himself. He is on it twice over, in a way. That line is the last English voice a finder would reach, and the boy who spoke it was young enough that the sentence he chose is a child's sentence, not a statement about our civilization, not a summary of our achievements. A greeting from the children, offered to whoever is out there, as though the two might have something in common. Underneath the human voices there are wails. Humpback Song, reportedly recorded off Bermuda in 1970. It sits under the greetings rather than beside them. The committee's decision, in effect. The letter should not be signed only by us. I have thought about that choice more than any of the others. Nobody asked them to include it. It costs capacity on an object where capacity was the whole constraint. And whoever opens this thing, if anyone ever does, will hear two species at once and no way to tell from the sound alone which of the two put it in the envelope. 90 minutes of the record is music. That is roughly 3/4 of everything the disc can hold, given over to one category, by a committee that never seems to have announced it as a statement of values. They simply kept choosing music until the space ran out, which is itself a decision, arrived at without anybody making it, of everything a species could send, its mathematics, its history, its arguments, its instructions. The object that left carries mostly songs. Timothy Ferris, the music journalist, produced that side of it, according to the committee's own account. 3 pieces of Bach, Beethoven twice, Stravinsky, a Navajo night chant, Javanese gamelan, a panpipe piece from Peru, a blues recording by the Texas street singer Blind Willie Johnson, a Bulgarian shepherdess singing alone, an aria of Mozart's, and a Guqin melody from China 2,500 years old called Flowing Streams, and the guitarist Chuck Berry, Johnny B. Good, recorded in 1958, 19 years old at the time it went aboard. The objection came from a man with more right to object than almost anybody alive. Alan Lomax, a folklorist, was the greatest field recordist America produced. He had spent decades carrying tape machines into places nobody else was going, sitting down with people whose music had never been written down by anybody, and preserving it. Prison farms, mountain hollows, fishing villages, the Caribbean, Spain, Italy. If the 20th century has a person who could reasonably claim to know what the world's music actually sounds like, it is him. His position on rock and roll, as the story goes, was that it was adolescent. Not worthless, adolescent. A young form, made by young people, for young people, in one country, very recently. Set beside 2,500 years of Guqin, it had not earned a place on an object leaving forever. That is not a small objection, nor was he being small in making it. Behind it sat a lifetime of evidence about what music is and how long it takes to become itself. Sagan's reply is the line everybody repeats, because it settles the argument in one move. There are a lot of adolescents on the planet. Johnny Be Good went aboard. I have gone back and forth about which of them was right. It does not matter in the end, because the disagreement is the interesting part. Two serious people, both correct, arguing about whether a message to eternity should represent what humanity has achieved, or what humanity is actually like on a Friday night. The record, in the end, does both, and that is not a compromise anybody designed. It is what happens when 6 people with a deadline each fight for the thing they love, and nobody has time to impose a theory on the result. 2 things were capped off, for reasons entirely unlike each other. The first is a photograph. John Lomberg, the artist running the picture side, wanted an image of a nude man and a pregnant woman standing together, plainly, holding hands. His own description of the pose was that they were quite unerotically holding hands. The reason for wanting it is obvious once you think about what the pictures are for. 115 images have to explain a species, what it is, how it is built, how it arrives. A pregnancy is not a decorative fact about us, it is the mechanism. NASA said no. You already know why. 5 years earlier, the Pioneer plaque had gone out. The correspondence had come back about decency. Nobody at the agency wanted that again, with an election cycle running and the budget to defend. So Lomberg redrew it. What is on the record is a silhouette, 2 black outlines, man and woman, in the same pose. Inside the woman's outline, drawn in, is the fetus. The biology survives. The bodies do not. It is worth saying that the refusal was not stupid. An agency that has to go back to Congress every year for money does not get to be indifferent about what runs in a newspaper. The committee wanted to describe a species. The agency had to survive the following spring. Both are real constraints. The object carries the mark of both. I find that a rather beautiful piece of work under pressure. It is also the only image on the disc where a finder is asked to accept a convention, a filled black shape standing in for a person, with no way to know it is one. Everything else on there is a photograph of the real thing. The second omission is the one everybody has heard about. It needs handling carefully because the story is better known than its paperwork. The version that circulates. Sagan wanted the Beatles, specifically, Here Comes the Sun. All 4 Beatles were in favour. EMI, which held the recording rights, refused. A licensing figure of $50,000 named against a production budget of 18. Here is what I can tell you honestly about that. The outline of it, that the Beatles were wanted, that a rights problem stopped it, comes from people close to the project. The specific numbers, along with the claim that all 4 agreed, are anecdote rather than document. Nobody has produced the letter. So, a rights problem kept the Beatles off the Voyager record. Probably. That is as far as the paper will carry anybody. I would rather tell you where the paper stops than round it up into a better story. What is certain is the shape of the thing. An object designed to outlast the planet, with a piece of music kept off it by a question about who owned the recording. On the 1st of June 1977, Anne Druyan telephoned a hotel. She had been looking for a piece of Chinese music and had found one, a Guqin melody called Flowing Streams, about 2,500 years old. That was the reason for the call. Sagan was not in his room. She left a message. When he called back, the conversation went somewhere neither of them had planned, and by the end of it, they had agreed to marry. According to both of their later accounts, they had not so much as kissed. They had been working together for weeks on a committee. The call lasted about an hour. By the end of it, they were engaged. Both of them then went back to work because there was a launch date. I want to be careful with this because it is the part of the story that gets told badly. It is usually told as romance with music under it. What actually happened is that two colleagues on a deadline had a phone call about a 2,500-year-old piece of music. Something else came out of it, and afterwards they hung up and went back to choosing photographs. 2 days later, she went to a hospital in New York and was wired up. The plan was straightforward on paper. Record a human nervous system for an hour, convert it to sound, put it on the record. Electrodes for brain activity, a trace for the heart, sensors for eye movement and for muscle. An hour of one person from the inside measured. The room would have been an ordinary room, a hospital in New York in June, a technician attaching leads and checking contacts, someone noting a start time on a form. Nothing about the setting knows what it is for. That is generally true of the moments people later decide were the important ones. She had thought about what to think about. Her intention, by her own account, was to go through the history of Earth in her head. Continents moving, the first cells, the invention of writing, cities, everything a mind could hold in an hour that might mean something to whoever eventually listened. That is what she went in planning to do. What she has said since is that her thoughts kept returning to the phone call. She was, by her own telling, 2 days engaged and lying still with wires on her head, trying to think about the invention of agriculture. The hour was compressed into about a minute of sound. It is on both records, and it is on them now, and it will be on them for as long as they are anything at all. Here is the part I keep coming back to. Nobody can read it. There is no technique, not in 1977, not today, not in any laboratory anywhere, for taking an hour of somebody's recorded brain activity and recovering what they were thinking about. You cannot get the continents back out of it. You certainly cannot get the phone call back out of it. Whatever is in that minute is sealed, permanently, by the physics of the measurement rather than by anybody's decision. So the record carries an hour of a specific person thinking about a specific thing on a specific afternoon, in a form that no finder will ever decode, and no human being will either. It is the most private thing anyone has ever made public. The cover is aluminium. Everything on it is a diagram, because words were not an option. Think about the problem for a moment. You have an object that plays sound by a method involving a needle, a groove, a particular rotation speed. Whoever finds it will not read any human language. They may not have ears. They will, however, be somewhere in a universe made of the same physics as this one. That is the entire common ground available. So the cover has to say, this is a disc, it turns at this rate, put this needle here, and the signal that comes out can be assembled into pictures like so. With no words, using only things that are true everywhere. Upper left, a drawing of the disc with the stylus resting in its starting position. Beside it, the time for one rotation, which is where the design gets clever. You cannot write 3.6 seconds, because a second is an arbitrary human unit, a leftover of Babylonian arithmetic. So the number is given in binary, counted in multiples of a different unit entirely, the time taken by one particular transition in a hydrogen atom, about 7/10 of a billionth of a second. Hydrogen is the most common thing in the universe. That transition happens the same way everywhere, forever, for everybody. It is the one clock nobody can be without. Upper right, how to rebuild a picture. The sound on the record, played back, can be drawn as lines across a screen. 512 of them stacked the way an old television built its image. The diagram shows that step by step, with no words in it. Then, because a diagram of a method can still be misread, a copy of the very first image on the record is printed alongside it, so the finder can check their own work against a known answer. That first image is a circle, nothing else. If your circle comes out as an oval, your settings are wrong, and you can see that they are wrong without anyone telling you. Lower left, the pulsar map carried over from Pioneer. 14 pulsars, each with its period written in that same hydrogen-based binary, radiating from a point. Pulsars slow down at known rates, so the map gives not only a position, but, for anyone reading it carefully, a date. Lower right, the hydrogen atom and the digit 1, establishing the notation. Then there is the patch. Electroplated onto the aluminium is a sample of uranium, the isotope written 238, about 2 centimeters across. Ultra pure. It sits there doing what uranium does, which is decay, at a rate nothing can alter. Half of it gone in 4.5 billion years. A finder who measures how much of it has turned into its daughter products knows how long it has been since somebody plated it on. Not approximately. From physics, out of the object itself, with no reliance on anything anyone claimed. They mailed a letter with a postmark that writes itself. That idea, incidentally, was not new in 1977. Somebody had proposed painting the Pioneer plaque with natural uranium for the same purpose 5 years earlier. It did not happen then. It got its flight the second time. On Friday the 29th of July, 1977, the record was placed aboard the first of the 2 spacecraft. NASA put out a release about it, as agencies do. It describes the object. It says what is on it and who chose it and where it is going. And it calls the disk copper, twice, which is not a slip and not a cover-up and not interesting in the way a scandal is interesting. It is what the people writing it understood the object to be. A copper disk with some plating on it, going out on a spacecraft. Not gold-plated copper, not the golden record. A copper disk, in the plain, flat language of a press release, on the day the thing was fitted to the spacecraft. I went looking through the launch week material after that, because once you notice a thing like that, you want to know how far it goes. 16 pages of it. The word gold appears exactly once. It appears in the list of photographs on the record, describing one of them, and the photograph is of a bridge. Golden Gate Bridge, Ansel Adams. A photograph by Ansel Adams of a bridge in San Francisco named for a strait which was named for a harbour in Istanbul. That is the only gold in 16 pages. That is the entire presence of the word gold in NASA's Launch Week account of the object we now universally call the Golden Record. So where does the name come from? Not from the committee, as far as anything shows. Not from the agency. It accumulated afterward, in newspapers, in documentaries, in the way people describe a thing to each other when they only have a moment and want to convey that it matters. And it's stuck so completely that the actual name has effectively gone. The object has one on its own cover. The words Ferris put where a record label would ordinarily be, cut into the metal. To the makers of music, all worlds, all times. That is what it is called by the people who made it in writing on the object. Nobody uses it. We call it the gold one. I do not think there is anything wrong with that particularly. It is simply what happened. A species built a thing, described it accurately in the paperwork as copper, and then spent 50 years calling it by the colour of its skin, which is, when you set it out plainly, a fairly recognisable way for us to behave about a valuable object. But it does mean the most famous fact about the most far-travelled object we have ever made is a name we gave it later, for a decision nobody wrote down, about a material that was never addressed to the reader. That is the shape of the thing. In a few minutes I will try to say what I think is actually underneath it. There is a figure attached to this object that everybody repeats, including me, earlier tonight. 1 billion years, sometimes 5. It is the reason the record means what it means. An hour of music that lasts a decade is a curiosity. An hour of music that outlasts the continents is something else entirely, and the figure is doing all of that work. So I went looking for where it comes from. The earliest place it turns up is not a paper. In June of 1977, before the discs had been cut, before they were plated, before the thing existed as an object at all, a statement went out over the president's signature to be carried aboard. The line everybody quotes from it is, "We cast this message into the cosmos." The statement also contains a promise about how long it will last. Consider the sequence there. The claim about the object's lifespan was signed by a head of state and dispatched before anybody had cut the lacquer, before the copper was struck, before the 8 discs went into the bath in Gardena. The promise preceded the thing. The other early appearance is in Sagan's own closing paragraph in the committee's book, written afterward, in the same passage where he reaches for the word murmur, the word that gave the book its title. 2 of the most quoted claims about the record, and both of them are prose, written by people who were, it should be said, entirely qualified to estimate it. Sagan was a planetary scientist. Drake had spent a career on exactly this kind of arithmetic. If either of them had sat down and worked it out, the number would be a good one. The question is only whether anybody did. What I could not find is a calculation. No paper, no method, no error bar. No named erosion rate, no assumed dust density, no statement of what last is even supposed to mean. Whether the disk survives, or the grooves survive, or a finder could still get a signal out of it. The 1977 press kit would settle where the number entered circulation, and it could not be retrieved from any archive reachable on this pass. I want to be exact about what that does and does not mean. It does not mean the number is wrong. Gold and copper in a vacuum, with no oxygen and almost nothing to strike them, genuinely are the sort of materials that last on those timescales. The physics is not in dispute. What is missing is the working. A number that carries the entire emotional weight of the object appears to have entered the world as a sentence in a presidential statement about a thing that had not been manufactured yet, and then to have been repeated by everybody, including by people like me, for 50 years. That is not a scandal. It is just how numbers travel when they are the right size for the feeling. The thing that will eventually ruin the record is dust. Not weather, not oxygen, not heat. Interstellar space has a scattering of grains in it, mineral specks, most far smaller than anything an eye could resolve, while the spacecraft moves through that scattering at speeds no object on Earth reaches. We know the grains are real because we caught them. A spacecraft called Ulysses in 1993 registered particles passing through the solar system that could not have come from it. Interstellar dust, streaming through at around 26 kilometers a second. We have measured the thing that will eventually ruin the record. We have counted it. What such a grain does on arrival has been rehearsed in a laboratory. Olivine, an ordinary mineral, the sort of thing these grains are made of, has been fired at metal plates at 3 to 7 kilometers a second, in grains between about 1/3 of a micron and just over 1 micron across. A micron being 1,000th of a millimeter. The deepest crater those impacts produced was 1.64 microns. Set that against a record groove, which is tens of microns deep. A single grain does not erase a song. It takes a chip out of one wall of a canyon. The canyon remains a canyon. That is the honest picture of the erosion. Not a disk dissolving, but an accumulation of very small craters over a length of time nobody has properly worked out, on a surface where the information is carried by a shape rather than by anything that can rot. As for where it is going, there is no going. The probes were aimed at planets. After the last of those encounters, they were simply released on whatever line the gravity had left them. Nobody selected a star. Nothing is being approached on purpose. The familiar version says Voyager 1 passes a star called Gliese 445 in about 40,000 years. Work published in 2019, tracing both probes against a far better catalogue of stellar motions, revises the picture. Different stars, different distances, different timescales, and, for both craft, encounters so distant that passes means within a light year or two. A light year or two is not an arrival. It is roughly the width of the gap between us and our nearest neighbour, the closest either of these objects is expected to come to anything for a very long time. So, back to the bath in Gardena, and the question we set down at the beginning. Nobody wrote it down. That is the finding. And I have turned it over for a while now, and I have stopped expecting it to resolve into a document. 6 people explained why a record rather than a plaque. They explained why a mother rather than a pressing. They explained why copper rather than nickel in a sentence about magnetometers. Every consequential decision in the object has its paragraph, and this one has none, which leaves the metal to speak for itself. Here is what gold is, as chemistry rather than as motive. Gold does not react. That is the whole of its character. It will not combine with oxygen, so it does not tarnish. It will not corrode. It has no interest whatever in anything around it. Every other useful metal is in some slow conversation with its surroundings. Gold declines to have the conversation. On Earth, that makes it good for rings and teeth and contacts. Out there, where there is no oxygen and nothing to react with in the first place, it makes a surface that simply stays a surface. So the property of gold that matters 5 billion miles out is indifference. And here is the thing that I think is actually underneath all of this. We chose the metal that means treasure. Our wedding rings, our best plate, the thing you reach for when you want somebody to understand, without being told, that this was the good stuff. That is what gold is for among us. And it is meant that for as long as we have had anything. But whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, across a distance and a span of time neither of us can hold in a head, will not know that. There is no reason they should. Gold will be, to them, an element with an atomic number, sitting in whatever table they have built, useful for the same reasons it is useful to us, and beautiful for no reason at all. The gold says nothing to the reader. It was never addressed to them, which means the most famous thing about this object, the thing we named it after, is the only part of it that is not a message. And it is, I think, the most human thing on the whole disk. They did not write down why. They may not have discussed it. Somebody in a chain of people, the committee, a project engineer, the plating shop, a technician with a rack of options, reached for gold for the same tangle of reasons anybody ever reaches for gold. Because it lasts, and because when a thing matters, you make it out of the good stuff. And because those two impulses are so wound together in us that nobody thinks to separate them. The record is out there now. Copper underneath, a skin of gold over it, laid down in a South Bay plating shop on an August Tuesday, 3 days after the first of the two had already gone. Both discs are still perfectly good. Nothing out there has touched them. To the makers of music, all worlds, all times. That is the line the people who made it cut into the metal, where the label would ordinarily be. It is the object's actual name. Almost nobody uses it. It has been travelling out of the solar system for nearly 50 years without a single person reading it. Sleep well, friends. It is still going. And that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you are still awake and this one stayed with you, I would be glad to know of it. A review if you are moved to leave one. A suggestion for a story you would like told. A gentle correction if I have gotten something wrong. But none of it is for now. It can keep until morning. There is nothing left to do. Let the room stay quiet and let yourself rest. I will be here.